All right, welcome all viewers. This is I guess it's not the Political Paradigm Shift podcast anymore because I don't have that group, so I can't really use that name. But this is the same podcast that I was doing before. And today I got Chuck and Chris here, and we're going to talk about we're going to talk about COVID, kind of a historical analysis now that everything's kind of blown over and what we think about how that was managed by the government and managed by other entities, including Twitter, and some First Amendment or not so First Amendment issues that existed with that, and then maybe get into some election stuff. So, okay, so to begin with, I guess we'll start out with talking about COVID. So interestingly enough, I just had COVID for I'm going to say probably third or fourth time, but officially only the second. And so, in other words, I only tested positive 2 times, but I did get sick other times where I either tested negative early on and my symptoms, and I just didn't bother testing again, or I didn't test at all. But I believe it was called, it begins with an E, the variation or the version of, not Omicron, but it's like
Epsilon,
not Epsilon, something else, four letters. Anyway, I think I had that kind, and it wasn't nearly as long. And it probably lasted like 3 days, but it wasn't particularly bad. The only thing I was really concerned with was long COVID. But the worst thing to do when you get COVID is to look up COVID, because then you have everything else, right? Yeah. You're gonna have COVID for the rest of your life and all the neurological symptoms that come along with that, et cetera, and so on. But anyway, so it was kind of front and center in my head about everything that had sort of happened and how people just weren't really concerned about COVID anymore. And so, at my job, there had been a couple people who had gotten it, and we were talking about it, and just nobody really just cares, right? Which is sort of like the opposite of what was happening originally. I mean, there's obvious reasons for that, right? Everybody's vaccinated, or they have natural immunity. It's not as severe as it used to be, although it might be more contagious now. The severity of it is almost near the common cold, maybe a little bit worse, right? But I started kind of thinking back on some of the policies and how everything kind of started, and I think that we can probably all agree there were some pretty significant mistakes made. I don't know about you, Chris. Maybe you're part of that really left-wing part of the internet that won't admit that anybody did anything wrong in terms of their reaction or overreaction to COVID. I'm certainly not. I think, though, I'm less rigid than Chuck is on this. But I definitely think that, in retrospect, kind of, looking at it now, we certainly could have made some better decisions when it comes to schools, made some better decisions when it comes to businesses, made some better decisions when it comes to masks, made some better decisions when it comes to just lots and lots of economic decisions that we made as a result. So I'm kind of, I kind of want to throw this at Chuck because I have an idea of what he's going to say, and I think I have at least a sort of rebuttal to it. But I kind of want to hear it out and get his fresh perspective, because I'm not sure I've heard it in about, several months at least. So, Chuck, was COVID as bad as you were saying it was, and all of the, in your view, all of the ramifications and consequences of the governmental overreach, as bad as it was, you were saying 2 years ago?
if you're asking me if the question is, was the threat of COVID commensurate with the public policy reaction, my answer is hell no. Again, but that is a very, very difficult question to quantify, because it's all about being able to make cost benefit analyses. And when we do it individually, I'm going to look at different things than you, than Chris, than the other 8 billion people on this marble. So yeah, so you can always claim in retrospect that, well, because I thought it was going to do this, that would justify this. And so in your mind's eye, it was all justified. But again, I don't think it was worth putting 25% of the workforce out of work. I do not think it warranted 2.5 years of essentially lost education for many children. I don't think it warranted this creation of an army of Karens who went around reporting people who were not wearing their masks while walking by themselves on a sidewalk. I don't think it cost our it was worth our soul, which we lost a little bit of that during this. I thought I was a fully mature adult, fully actualized dude before COVID, but our collective reaction really changed me, and not for the better. It showed me that many of my fellow human beings would sell their souls and your soul for even the illusion of safety, even where such safety could not be guaranteed or even assured. Just the thought of them doing something rather than nothing was enough to surrender a certain amount of civil liberties. The problem is when you're trying to put together collective health policy, you are not allowing for that individual cost benefit analysis, like I talked about. I would say also, to back up even further, for the past 3 generations, we have been increasingly preaching the fact that individual cost benefit analyses are not really allowed anymore. You wait and sit back and tell you what the government is going to say to do about problem A, B, or C. And we have dissuaded people from taking these self-assessments, of being able to take a sober look at facts, extrapolate possibilities, and say, okay, based upon this, here's what I'm going to do or not going to do. They want collective decisions made. And I understand in the pandemic, collective actions of some sort have to be taken. It's you can't have 330 million different U.S. health policies. I get that. But we have inured people over the past 3 generations to the point where they no longer want the responsibility of making a cost benefit analysis in an individual CBA. We're not really allowed to in so many other places. And I think with COVID, we saw what's happened when over half of the adults have been grown or have been raised in an environment where they were not encouraged to look at things through sober eyes and to discern and to make decisions based upon the evidence they had. So yes, our collective reaction to COVID really opened my eyes, and it was not in a good way. It demonstrated to me a lot of people are willing to do a lot of things to me and to others in order in exchange for the illusion of safety, or the at least the illusion that I'm 1% safer than I was a minute ago. Again, just I'll try not to monopolize the time. I could go on a while about this, but more or less in the early summer, say May, June of 2020, most people had a pretty good handle on what COVID was and what it wasn't. Yes, there was always new information coming in about new variants, mutations, because that's what viruses do. But by the early summer of 2020, we had a decent idea of what it was and what it wasn't. We knew that it was particularly deadly to older populations, to those with immunocompromised was a new word we threw out in 2020. That is to say, you got pre-existing conditions, asthma or something like that, or other, diabetes certainly, other health maladies that made it worse. But we also knew that the younger and healthier you were, the chance of it being a severe imposition was almost zero. And it was also almost zero for children. And armed with that, I think we had enough collective information in early summer 2020 to not have proceeded with the shutdown of schools for almost 2 entire school years. Again, I forgive a lot of stuff, February, March, April of 2020, because we were just learning. This was big. And we were in uncharted waters. I forgive an awful lot, pretty much anything that happened there. But after that, we started to get a handle on what this was and what this wasn't. And um, Ron DeSantis, with all the problems I had with him, and I had many problems with him, he likes to use government as a tool, and that's not conservative. That's the opposite. But he and a few other governors looked at the facts and said, okay, based upon what we're seeing here, we are going to focus our efforts on the most vulnerable populations while trying to minimize the disruption to everyone else. And I think no matter who you're talking to here in 2023, in retrospect, that was a little closer to the truth than was some of the other reactions. Again, I'll have more to say later, I think, about the autopsy that's being done on our COVID response by others. But as we look back, I don't think among reasonable people there's any doubt that the best reaction to this was those who targeted the at-risk, the really at-risk populations, while largely taking a laissez-faire stance with the younger populations. I said at the time, based upon what we knew, again, early summer 2020, that was probably the best approach. And I was called killer and other things for that. COVID fucked some people up, man. I mean, fucked them up in the head. There are people I know here that I respected that began calling me horrible names simply because I asked for scientific justification for COVID-19 public policy. That's all I did was like when California outlawed outdoor dining for the second time, I put a message. I said, okay, what's the science for this? Tell us, why are you doing this? And this lady, you don't know her, Pat Eastwood. I've known her since I was a kid. Lives near me. Said, why are you so callous, Chuck? Can't you see that people are dying from this? I said, Pat, all I'm asking for is justification. That's it. I just want to hear the science. I think that's the fucking least government can do, is to justify policies. That is the absolute least we should expect of them. But and they're not the only ones, were so damn scared by everything. They saw any questioning of any policy as akin to me wanting to walk through a nursing home and unclog my nose on the residents. They could not differentiate. They saw even questioning policy as evil. Someone we both know, Roxanne Max, called me a killer because, again, I wanted to know the scientific justification behind these policies. People lost their fucking minds, and I still have not made up with him. That's tough, but I got much more to say, but that's kind of the thesis of where, yes, I think we overreacted by many, many degrees.
Chris?
Well, I respect Chuck's stance. I'm not 100% on board with what he's saying, but I think he's a lot more nuanced and reasonable than most people that are on the right. So because he's like the only person from the right that I usually hear. Well, I wouldn't say the only, but there's not a whole lot of them that end up saying that, hey, I give you the benefit of the doubt of the first few months, at least when people are trying to figure stuff out. It's hard enough to get people to admit that much, that it was an emergency, and you're not going to have that scientific data right off the back, right? And it just is what it is. So I think to a certain extent, we got to expect to have our leaders to be able to react to these type of situations. And I think that in the initial stage, I think that there was a lot of people who had hope that we could actually kind of stifle this thing out and not have to worry about it, I guess, to a certain extent. But I think that we weren't willing to do the policies that were probably going to be necessary for it to do it at those initial stages. So I think at some point, they probably could have been a little bit more open on the fact that we need to let that go and just try to manage it as best as possible. And it's going to turn into the next version of the flu, basically, which is kind of what happened. And I think early on, it was a lot more serious than people give it credit for. Those hospitals were filling up. It was hard to find a lot of the nurses and staff and everything to be able to hold the type of load. So I think a lot of the shutdowns just helped to manage the load to a certain extent. You have a lot more people at home and able to do that and earn a living or get by somehow or whatever. help keep things to a manageable state until we can get to a point where we can actually be able to better manage the higher influx of people that are coming into our ER rooms. And, we saw how it was getting kind of crazy. Certain places were having like frozen trucks or whatever to help carry bodies, and hospital lots are working outside in parking lots and parking structures and stuff like that. So I mean, it did get out of control. I think most people actually know somebody who passed away or were severely hospitalized from that. And I think earlier on, I think to me it seemed like there was like one perspective, which is the government, scientists, and so on and so forth, versus I don't know, a whole lot of other folks who got kind of combined together as anti-vaxxers, when it could be separated out a little bit more and more. But those other groups never argued with each other. They mainly argued against the government, and to a certain extent that's understandable because they're the one that's making the policies and in charge and everything like that. But I think I would have liked to be able to hear a little bit more nuance to kind of stratify out what reasonable arguments are and what are unreasonable arguments are. Because I agree with Chuck 100% that this is about a cost benefit analysis. Everybody has to make that judgment for themselves. There's no vaccine that is for everybody, right? You have to make all your decisions with your doctor, and weigh the risks. And I think that, there's risks that come with, not getting the vaccine and not having that extra protection and, possibly getting COVID and passing away or going to hospital, right? There's risk on that side just as much as there's risk on the other side of taking a vaccine and having some bad reaction on the other end. And being able to have a good dialogue back and forth that's reasonable about that. And I think it was hard to get to that point to me because there was just too much conspiracy theory and crazy stuff. It's like, hey, you can't believe the doctors, they're making up the deaths. They're not really people in the hospital and all this other stuff. It's like, you got the crazy stuff that getting traction. You got more nuanced and realistic, objections that actually have merit that need some traction. You don't even know what to focus on because there's so much garbage out there that you really can't have a good discussion. And I think that by the time Omicron came around, that's when we started noticing, the more milder symptoms coming along. And I think at that point, a lot of folks took a victory lap and started saying, yes, I told you it wasn't nothing. But I mean, it had to wait till it got to that stage before it became nothing, so to speak. You know what I mean? It still is something, it's still something kind of like how we worry about getting flu shots every year. It's kind of down to that stage, and there's certain populations that definitely do need to look out for that a little bit more vigilantly than others. But I mean, at the end of the day, I think there's most of this policies come down to local politicians who made their decisions on shutting down their local areas. And you got to feel out your community on what kind of risk and things that they're willing to take in order to do those types of things. And I think a lot of times we kind of nationalize our politics quite a bit and want to blame everybody up at the top for a lot of decisions that are happening a whole lot further down lower on the chain. But I think it's a time when we saw a lot of our ugly side in terms of, a lot of conspiracy, a lot of fear mongering, a lot of pointing finger and looking down at the other people. There's people who, like you said, where, if you're not wearing a mask, people looking down their noses at you and stuff, as well as if, even the people that are wearing a mask picking at them and making jokes about them and stuff, so on and so forth. I think people need to, do what makes sense to them, make their best decision. And I think there was just so much noise and clutter, nobody knew what to believe and everything. And we really never had to have a good discussion about it to regionally hash these things out like human beings.
You made a good point, Chris, about a lot of this being at the local and state level. I'm teaching, this should scare the hell out of both of you. I'm teaching a government course this year at the high school level to a group of children. But I pointed out to them the fact that because of the Constitution and the way our federalist system is set up, the president or the chief executive at the federal level actually has very little authority in terms of setting COVID policy for the nation. I mean, they can control government installations, military bases, federal property, but most of the decisions at this level were done by 50 state governors, and to even more to another extent, some of the local, the city ordinances, county ordinances, or whatever. So a lot of the COVID policy that we talk about was done at the state or local level. And you're absolutely right. We turned it into a national debate because we're a nation fighting off COVID, and naturally the debate's going to shift in that direction. But yeah, the bread and butter of this was the state and local responses, the good, the bad, the ugly, and all the in between. So yeah, I think Chris, you made a very good point there. We sometimes forget that.
So I just want to ask some questions, and the first couple are to both of you. And I don't know if you guys remember this. I'm just trying to get a timeline of events, but I know you kind of threw out an arbitrary timeline there, Chuck, in terms of like the early summer of 2020. We kind of knew what was going on, and we should have been able to kind of calibrate our response a little bit better, just based on the information that we had at that time. Do you guys know or remember when the first vaccines came out?
It was
Wasn't until end of 2020, right?
yeah, it was like the first
end of
January,
2020. It was in December. First people started getting
2020,
shots, and
yeah.
more so in the spring into the 2021 is when you got most of the people in the population started getting the shots who wanted one by then.
Yeah, because
Okay, so
the
that's
healthcare workers were the first in line, I believe, essential workers like that.
Yep.
Yeah, I think you're about
Right.
December 2020.
you muted yourself,
It
Chris.
is.
I think that was an accident. All right. So, but yeah, I just wanted to add on as far as like with the going back to schools and everything. I think the other issue that goes on to it is whether or not the workers are willing to work without the vaccines before going back to work school too. So that's another issue. I know the teachers, they have strong unions, and whether or not that's something that means a lot to them. Just because we want them to go back doesn't mean they necessarily would have gone back, because I'm sure there's some of them that definitely were just as nervous about getting COVID and didn't want to just show up around a whole bunch of we call them snotty nosed kids, right? They spread germs pretty easily, right? So I mean, it's one thing to want them to go there. It's whether I don't really know whether or not we could have actually had it realistically happen, because I think that it may happen in certain districts, but I don't see it happening nationwide, because I don't think that many people would have came back.
Well, I think that that's sort of dependent on what. So initially, when we had the vaccines, when they came out with the vaccines, we thought, or at least the information that we were given, is that the vaccine protected from transmission, right? Was a very solid protection from transmission. That turned out to not be true. I mean, essentially. I mean, maybe you can argue on some level, if you're not symptomatic, you're less transmissible. But I mean, as a general matter, the vaccines weren't protecting you from transmitting the virus, right? Is that accurate?
And if they were, it was by percentage points. I mean, and there was also the shots are supposed to lessen the symptoms, and they did to a certain degree, I feel sure, based upon the raw data. And we're talking about these first round of shots. This has nothing to do with the booster since then. But unfortunately, the powers that be lost more trust by telling us, some explicitly, some in so many words, that if you take the virus, you weren't going to get COVID. Now, the president of the United States said that point blank. Even at the time, I and you and everybody else knew that was bullshit.
Which president?
Yeah, President Biden at this time. Okay. Yeah. And there was Rachel Maddow and some other, the talking head said, if you take this, you will not get COVID, which was untrue. We knew it at the time, and it was just frustrating that they were never taken into account for that, because that's a pretty egregious lie there. That's misinformation.
But if I understand, I agree with you. I think people did that. But if I remember correctly, initially the so-called experts were telling us that, right? So they were actually, I mean, Rachel Maddow is, in my opinion, not great, but she was actually getting that information through the CDC, through various experts who we were, supposed to listen to. I mean, am I remembering correctly?
No, I mean, more or less. The problem was, and the Twitter files and all of it showed us later, a lot of the alphabet government agencies were working within themselves and again, government agencies, private agencies work together to control a message, to try to send a unified message out. I get that. But in this case, the message was incorrect. And so the talking points that Maddow and the commentators on the right have their little talking points that are sent to them by think tanks too. This is not a left phenomenon, but they were trying to deliver a consistent message. Shots good, shots vital. And some of them oversold it, quite frankly. Maddow certainly was one of them. And but yeah, insofar as they were regurgitating what the CDC was telling them, yeah, because they were part of the cadre that was trying to put out this unified message.
All right. So I guess my question then would be, isn't it understandable, at least initially, and now I get what you're saying about overselling it and having a consistent message or politicizing it, etc. But isn't it understandable if the experts say this, right? If the agency that we're looking towards for guidance in this particular area is telling us this is the result of getting the vaccine, that spreading that message is understandable. And in addition to that, I mean, if they actually thought that, if that's what their research at the time was saying, I mean, that at least in its initial phases is a forgivable offense given the unique scenario.
I didn't mean to interrupt, but not when we know what we do now, again, thanks to the Twitter files, that those agencies knew from the get-go that it was not 100% effective or even close to that. Thanks to, love him or hate him, but thanks to Elon Musk, we now know, based upon the communication they had with Twitter, but we now know that even from the get-go, these alphabet agencies knew that it was not 100% as they were selling to us. And so, yeah, ordinarily, Nick, you make a good point. If the CDC says it, I mean, who am I, Joe Sixpack here to deny that? But now we know Joe Sixpack was closer to the truth than was the CDC.
All right, so I didn't know that part. So what you're telling me about one of my problems with the Twitter files is it's like these convoluted, we can get to this, but it's sort of this very convoluted, a lot of information, way too much information that's been evaluated.
It's meta stuff, no doubt.
Right. That was evaluated and then targeted and, in my opinion, weaponized and disseminated in a way that was intentional, right, to sort of further the cynicism that is already widespread throughout the country. That's my personal opinion. It's why I don't like Elon Musk. Mm-hmm. Not that we shouldn't have transparency, not that those types of facts aren't 100% necessary for us to know, especially in dealing with another pandemic, so we can hold these different agencies accountable so it doesn't happen again, because, this is a big deal. Yeah. So I guess I just didn't kind of pay attention to a lot of that stuff because I didn't know what I should believe or how they were sort of providing that information. So I appreciate that. So if what you're saying is true and I have no reason not to believe it, then fair enough.
Yeah.
I guess one of my whole things with COVID is, and this is, sort of just kind of responding, maybe not necessarily to you, Chuck, because maybe your opinion is much more reasonable, but more the right-wing rigid people, is that, look, I mean, it's not every day that you get these insane, pandemics that, worldwide pandemics that occur like this one. And so how different places respond, I mean, it's almost inevitable that places are going to make mistakes. My personal opinion is it's not the mistakes that are the problem. It's the failure to take accountability for the mistakes on everybody's end, right? So whether you're Donald Trump, who's telling Bob Woodward that he knew that the pandemic was as bad as it was and lied to us, right? Or it's Rachel Maddow or whoever is equivalent on the left telling us that, we need to, tape ourselves into our closets or something, whatever. So I think that is where the mistakes are. I also think the other sort of more egregious mistake is stuff like during the pandemic, my ex-wife, her grandmother passed away. And we ended up going to the funeral, and it was a pandemic funeral, right? So we all had to sit in our cars and, just sit there and watch the whatever, the ceremony take place. And, for a lot of people, that was a really big deal. And for obvious reasons, their loved ones are dying. They don't get to say goodbye in the way that they wanted to, et cetera, and so on. Fair enough, in my opinion, if you have a pandemic that's severe enough where that is, people are going to die the way we believe they were going to die. The problem I have with that is the same experts telling us that, right, were the same ones telling us that the BLM protests were absolutely okay.
You
right?
just pinpointed the exact moment where they lost me 100%, Nick.
Right. So it's that to me didn't make any sense. Now, it would have made sense, right? And right now I'm quoting some conservative people I listen to. But it would have made sense if they could have had some sort of definitive concrete goal that they could have achieved, right? Like the goal cost benefit analysis would have said, well, if we agree with everything, if BLM would have essentially cured racism, right, or police brutality at that time, like if what they were doing was so influential that it would have had this effect, therefore the experts saying that this is important enough, then I would have sort of understood it. But nobody can obviously guarantee that. And so what made it so that those types of things were okay, but funerals for your dead loved one, child, mother, brother, whoever, was not, right? So I don't think it just lost you then. I think it lost a lot of people, right? And that to me was such an egregious mistake on the part of especially the people that we consider these ostensible experts, right? Because the next time they say something, they're losing 40-50% of the country, right? So in any event, I'm sort of going off on a tangent now, but if you guys want to respond to that.
You haven't heard from Chris in a while.
All right. So, well, I guess first I'll say is that the way I remember the event playing out in 2001, as far as the vaccine, Pfizer and Moderna, they had done their trials and they had like a 94% efficacy rate for their vaccines being effective. And so that would suggest that it was effective in making sure that people, actually didn't, get sick or whatever. And I think it was more so like as we shifted into the summer of 2021, especially as Delta variant came out, that's when you really started hearing more and more people that were vaccinated still getting the virus a whole lot more. I mean, with a 95% efficacy rate, it's not 100%. So there's always going to be a few people that slip through the crack. But I think I felt like early on in the early at the early part of the year when it was when the Delta variant wasn't around, most of the people that were vaccinated were doing pretty fine with it. It's just, I guess, like I said, as the mutations came, Delta variant came around, and then as well as, Omicron later on that year, that, I think that vaccine was pretty much out of date by that time. So I think there's a couple of things that were, kind of mysteries at that time because you really just didn't have enough time to do the research to know. And that's because number one is, how effective is it again, and how much does the virus mutate so that, these previous vaccines will be, basically useless in a short period of time or something like that, right? That's something we just simply could not know at that point in time because we just haven't had the time to see it unfold yet. Also, the other factor is just the same reason why we get cold viruses all the time. Our body does develop some immunity to it after we get a cold, but that immunity only lasts, or the antibodies only last a short period of time. And so at some months later, you really can catch the same cold all over again. And I think that the coronavirus, the COVID-19, had basically both of those aspects to it. That over time, the antibodies that raise up in our body, they start going down over time. About 6 months later or something, you know, they're talking about boosters and stuff, right? And so it just doesn't hold out. We know we have certain vaccines where we can take one, and or maybe just an extra booster here or there, and you know, you got almost lifetime or, you know, decades worth of coverage. But in this particular case, it just wasn't true about this vaccine. And we couldn't know that until later on. But as we saw it as time went on, it was like, all right, we were hopeful in these vaccines, we're pushing them out. But I think as we just saw it coming along, we just saw that it wasn't giving us a lifetime of, playing in the park and not have to worry about COVID ever again, you know? So it's just that, yeah, I think that we had high hopes and high expectations. It didn't live up to what it was because we just didn't know what we were dealing with. And once we saw what we're dealing with, then I think the messaging needs to change up, of course. And I think the messaging changes up pretty slow as we see things coming along, because I can see stuff come along and then eventually they, eventually get on track to giving new messaging. But I think there's just a lot of stuff that could have went better, of course. Like let's say in the very beginning with masks and stuff, they were trying to conserve the N95s for the hospital workers and stuff like that. So they're first telling folks not to worry about masks, and then later on they start telling people to mask. I think once you start giving change in stories, people are going to get nervous, and that conspiracy is going to rise up and all this other stuff. And even if you feel like you have a good reason for telling people not to worry about masks because they weren't available, and then finally later on you decide to backtrack on it or whatever, I mean, you still have to think those things through and try to make sense out of it. And then there's also the fact that at that time people still weren't making N95 masks or anything like that. They were making just random any old piece of cloth mask. Now, of course, those aren't going to be as effective as a good N95 mask and so on and so forth. And so again, I think past research in terms of the effectiveness of various different types of masks was just kind of weak and not as strong as it could have been. So I think a lot of people just didn't know how effective masks would be going into this pandemic, but we were to give people something and hope to just lower the amount of virus floating around in the air. And I used to tell people all the time around that time and stage that if you're just wearing like a t-shirt over your face, don't expect that to be you're 100% safe when you're out and about. You still need to take whatever 6 feet, whatever precautions you want, well, I mean, even 6 feet is actually kind of small distance considering how they tell you how far coughs and stuff like that, sneezes can travel, right? So, but I mean, they had to get, I think to a certain extent, the government has to give some type of guidance for people to work with that they can understand at a basic level, because not everybody's going to be, internet PhDs and figure this stuff out on their own. And not everybody is science minded and stuff. So it's like, all right, 6 feet. It just gives you the general idea that you need to get away from people and give somebody a number to work with at least, so that we can actually show up at a grocery store and get groceries and, I don't know, somewhat reasonably exist. Because if you tell people they have to be like 30 feet apart, how's that going to work for a grocery store line, right? So something has to be somewhat practical. They're giving the information out. It's not 100% accurate. It's not, policy and science are really two different things. The way I look at it in my book, they can't really be the same thing. You can do the science, but the science really doesn't tell you what the policy should be. I mean, from a certain perspective, you can say, well, based on the science, this might be smart, but it's still two separate things in my eyes. And I think that I give a little bit of grace in their ability to interpret this stuff and try to make the best decisions they can with, and all that stuff. But it's just, it's the best we can do trying to put things together. It was a bad situation altogether.
So maybe the solution to that was to not have the experts, the scientists, making political commentary, right?
As soon as they slipped into that realm, for me, it was over. Chris, you're absolutely right. Science is not policy. Science is information, facts, etc. Here's the science. What you do with it is up to you in terms of policy. But yes, Nick, when that group of, I think, 150 experts, not just CDC, but a lot of leading epidemiologists, when they sent out that open letter, which said that the George Floyd protests were actually okay, safety-wise, what they were doing was they were doing a cost benefit analysis. They were basically saying, okay, here's the risk of you being shoulder to shoulder with people, even if you're wearing masks. shoulder to shoulder, screaming at the top of your lungs, doing this or whatever for 4 hours. Yeah, there's a degree of danger there, but it's okay. It's acceptable because the goals are laudable. That is a cost benefit analysis, the same cost benefit analysis that they denied us a chance to do. Every one of us should have been able to make the same cost benefit analysis that they did when they drafted that letter. They looked at the risks of the activity, the protesting activity, and they determined that the possible benefits outweighed the risks. And you know what? We do that every fucking day. Every day we weigh the cost and the benefits of something. If we wanted to eliminate highway auto fatalities, we could just about do it tomorrow by lowering the national speed limit to 20 miles an hour. We're not going to do that because the costs outweigh the benefits. That is a cost benefit analysis. And what these people, these experts did in that respect was use the same cost benefit analysis that they denied to us. They denied us a chance to do that. Plus, again, as Chris pointed out, science is not policy, and they were crossing the line. They were conflating science and policy, and they lost me there. I mean, I don't think they had me before, but they absolutely lost me there because at that point I knew it was nakedly partisan and political, and I knew we were in for a bad trip, and we were.
So I feel like you're making two points, and I kind of want to just separate them if they can be. So the first point, which I 100% agree with, is there's some ideological stuff going on, right? With the scientists, the academics, the people in these institutions sort of making these sort of political statements or whatever this letter was that they drafted up. But there's another sort of something, and maybe I'm misreading what you're saying, but let me just ask the question. Do you feel like on a separate level, aside from people just kind of being ideological, but and maybe you can't sort of detach them, but do you feel like there was like a conspiracy there? Like Chuck, this is specifically to you. Do you feel like there was sort of like a larger conspiracy, within the government or the administrative state or whatever you want to call it, in order for them to sort of kind of gain control of the culture in a sort of power play? And how would you, and if you do believe that, what would you say is how would you argue that, like based on what evidence?
I don't know if it's a conspiracy in the classic sense as much as it is government doing what governments generally do. They want to control information, and those who control information in this day and age are the most powerful. Information is power. Used to be we measured power in terms of the amount of raw goods and materials a nation could produce. Now we measure it in terms of their mastery of the flow of information. So yeah, it's not a conspiracy. It's just what governments generally do at any level. I mean, they want to control the message. Things are a lot tidier when everyone is on the same page. I mean, that happens in a family. You want agreement within your family unit. You want agreement in your civic club, and if you're a government, you want general agreement amongst your citizenry. I don't doubt that some of the scientists were truly interested in, and there's nothing wrong with being interested in social justice. It's a very laudable goal. But my issue was they were doing what I wanted to do for me and my family, to make a cost-benefit analysis based on the information. They looked at the information, the risks of this type of behavior during a pandemic, and juxtapose that against the potential benefits of the social change that these protests, best case scenario, would have elicited. And they decided it was worth the risk. We do that every day. We go down the interstate. We decide, okay, I need to make up some time here. I can do it safely at 80 miles an hour. At 90 miles an hour, it becomes a little bit more unsafe. I'm not willing to do that. That's a cost benefit analysis. And they
Yeah.
wanted to be able to do that, but they did not want us to do that.
Okay. So just to be clear, I'm not using conspiracy has this negative connotation to it, the term, right? I'm using it in the sense where it was a coordinated effort to
Oh, there was lots of coordination. Yeah.
conspire. Okay. So I guess my question is, because I think what you're saying, you're talking about this letter, right? You said it was 150
Something like
scientists, people,
The experts.
academics, whoever, scientists, right?
Yeah.
Who sort of came together. I mean, is there any evidence that they were coordinating with the federal government when they did that?
Yeah, that's the one that's a little bit tricky. They were, insofar as there were CDC officials who signed on to that letter. To that extent, yeah, it was government, but certainly government wanted to amplify the voices of those experts who agreed with them. And as the Twitter file showed, they put in a whole lot of effort to silence the voices of those experts who did not agree with them. And it was just very frustrating being told the whole time that, oh no, Twitter's not, silencing these people. They're just, doing this to the, and the Twitter files demonstrated what we knew was happening all the time, that government and non-government agencies acting at the pleasure of government were coordinating an effort to silence or to limit the reach of these people who were saying things that they did not like or disagreed with, that ran counter to their message. It was very frustrating. After all this was revealed in late 2021, the people who were assuring us it was not happening, once we demonstrated it was happening, they said, that's no big deal. Yeah, everybody knew that was going on. No, motherfucker, you were just telling me 2 months ago that this was absolutely not happening. And so, yeah, lying to my face really pisses me off like that. And they did a lot of that. They did an awful lot of that. Well, we really, we weren't really silencing. Yes, you were. Anytime. And that's when it became a First Amendment issue. If Twitter decides of their own accord not to bury this or downplay it in their terms of their algorithm, where you don't see it as much. If they do that of their own accord, that's one thing. That's not a free speech issue. They own their platform. There you go. But based upon the absolutely incestuous relationship that the Twitter file showed developed between Twitter and these non-government agencies and direct government agencies, because of that, it becomes a First Amendment issue. Only the state can censor. And to the extent that the state was certainly influencing Twitter's decisions. I love the verbiage that the Twitter file showed. We think it would be good if you ... We suggest that you ... At no point did they ever come out and say you had better, but it's almost like if Tony Soprano told the convenience store owner, it would be good if you had this money available by the end of the day. That's more than a suggestion. If the FBI is sending you suggestions, that's more than a suggestion.
But the difference there is that people know that Tony Soprano breaks people's legs or kills them if he doesn't do it. I'm not sure that we have any evidence that the Biden administration is going around breaking any Twitter person's legs.
No, they don't break their legs, they break their business.
Well, right. So so what you're stating here is that there's a different sort of coercion going on, right?
Any issue or any direct or any request that comes from the government comes from an entity with almost unlimited resources and authority. It comes with it comes the promise of government force, a force that can legally jail you, at least that a group that can legally take your shit, a group that can legally kill you. The local haberdasher can't do that. The government can. So anything that comes from the government, you have to know that with it comes the possibility of unlimited enforcement, because the government has that capability to do it legally. And so, yes, it's a whole different ballgame when it's the government that suggests you take these actions. If it's an investor that says it, that's one thing. If it's a consumer or a vendor that says it, that's another thing. When it's the government. It is completely different.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. Would you agree that COVID, as a general matter, when you have like hundreds, tens of thousands of people, however, million, whatever the number is, of people dying in a pandemic, is an extraordinary, unique, and exceptional situation that requires that we approach that in a different way, and or agree that if you have a platform like Twitter or Facebook that is responsible for, disseminating various forms of news to millions of people, that they have an interest or even an obligation to, at least in that interim period while that pandemic is occurring, to make sort of suggestions like that. Like, is that even in an avoidable scenario? For instance, what if Twitter was a completely different entity at the time, and it was going on, and it had the same sort of influence, and it was going on saying, do not get vaccinated, whatever you do not get vaccinated, and we had specific research indicating that that message was directly related to hundreds of thousands of people dying that didn't have to die.
Mhm.
At that point, would you say that it would be unreasonable for the government to just make a suggestion? And I know this is an extreme example, and I'm not trying to say
I understand what
you're
you're saying. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I understand what you're saying.
I'm just trying to get clarification.
The problem with that is anything you're willing to let government do once, you need to be willing to let them do that in perpetuity, because you have no control over how long the emergency lasts. There's an old saying, for statists, the government is entitled to do certain extraordinary, extra constitutional things if there is an emergency. The caveat under that is, we'll always find an emergency. We'll always find a reason to do that. So if you're going to let government do something once, you have to ask yourself, am I willing to let them do this in perpetuity? Because that is a possibility. If you give a government extra powers during an emergency, guess what? They're going to find a whole lot of emergencies to exercise this authority. That's why we have to be very, very, very careful about that. In the abstract, Nick, no, of course, this was an unusual circumstance. And if the CDC makes a suggestion, that's to be expected, I suppose. But again, with these suggestions come the possibility of government force. Even if the clerk at the DMV tells you something, whether she or he realizes it or not, behind her words, backing his words, is the possibility of government force. You have to take that into account every single time. That's why it is like a fire. It's a dangerous servant and a cruel master. We have to be very, very careful. Most people in April of 2020 were willing to give 2 weeks to flatten the curve a try, even though people like me and many others like me knew that it was going to be more than 2 weeks, and they were going to try to make it last longer than 2 weeks, no matter what happened during those 2 weeks. And that turned out to be true. But we understand, in a perfect society, we would be able to collectively weigh these costs and benefits and have a sober and productive debate about it. Unfortunately, we are not a healthy society right now, and we are less healthy from that standpoint after COVID because of all the mistrust that was exacerbated during the last 3 years. The government has given us no reason to think that they are more trustworthy now than they were 3 years ago. They made lots of mistakes, and cavalierly, like government does, they will not admit to the mistakes. I really think the CDC could have done a lot of good if at some point last year they issued a mea culpa and tried to level with the people. Look, we made mistakes. We tried to err on the side of caution. We tried to err on the side of fewer deaths. We tried to err on the side of lowering the speed limit to try to cut down on the highway safety deaths, to extend that metaphor a little bit. Yes, we should not have lowered it to 40 miles an hour, and we should not have enforced that. We are sorry. We will try to take other things into account again in the future when we set policy. But there's been none of that. You know what they've given us? They've given us a bunch of fucking gaslighting by trying to change what they told us just a year or two ago, by trying to convince us that they didn't really say what they actually said. So fuck them. I mean, up one side, down the other. They had a chance to issue a mea culpa and to at least show just a modicum of humility for the many, many egregious things they got wrong, but instead they're doubling down and calling you the bad guy for noticing what they said. So they have lost all basis for trust with me. They can go to hell.
Chris?
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, the government earns a degree of what Chuck says for sure. But one thing I will say is that there is a relationship between the government and these social media companies. I mean, over the years, in terms of, there's always been concerns about, what kind of content spreads on there, what type of, negative stuff that might arise out from it, and so on and so forth. And so they're always being pulled in front of Congress to testify and, try to hold them accountable and all this other stuff. So they have kind of a weird relationship where there's pressure. There's politicians that are saying, hey, I got some constituents that want to regulate you guys. But to a certain extent, we're going to still let you have freedom if you promise to go ahead and self-regulate. And that's kind of what they're dealing with right now. Facebook and Twitter, they've decided to self-regulate to a certain extent. So they've taken it on themselves. There was no decree that said that, hey, if you don't shut down on, bad COVID information, then, you're going out of business necessarily. There's no law or nothing legally that can do against that. But at the same time, I think to a certain extent, they want to play ball to a certain extent. It may be for reasons that, I don't know, maybe they want their platforms to be more friendly to people who agree with that idea or whatever. But they're playing ball with it basically because of that relationship, and I think they don't want anything to be regulated, so they're willing to go along to a certain extent just to be able to have that freedom to, do whatever they want, not have to, listen to a law to tell them to do that type of thing. And so it does create that weirdness scenario to where, when the government comes to them and says, hey, this information is not true, can you push back on it? Or, or even if we go to more like national security things, such as, hey, Russia's putting out this information and, we think, and they're trying to push this angle, or China's trying to do this because, America, we do stuff to other countries as well and stuff like that. But in order to create dissension, maybe if, people get mad and hate each other enough, they may rise up and try to topple over somebody's government, and we try to ride the wave of that. But if they see other countries trying to do the same thing at us, I know if I were somebody working at the FBI, and I could see clear as day, yep, there's Russia doing their thing, trying to get us divided this way, that way, the other. Do we just sit there and just let them do it? Or do we, actually step in and it's like, well, hold on a second, we can tamp down on some of that. And so with, and those are not easily made decisions at the end of the day, because when the government does step down to try to step in and say something, and then the social media companies oblige and do something about it, then we have to deal with things such as, hey, this Hunter Biden story, ended up getting, tamped down or whatever, because foreign countries were pushing it, you know what I'm saying? And so therefore, maybe that gave an advantage here or there. So with everything tangling in with our politics and how divided we are, there's no real effective way to do anything to have any effective influence to stop either foreign threats or even threats of a bug that comes here. It's like if we do something, it's like damned if they do, damned if they don't, to a certain extent for the government. And I think part of that, I think we as citizens have to take credit for just being so divided and not trusting of one another, that we can't allow anything to actually happen for there's nobody that we can trust for our own good to actually look out for us. So that we're just kind of stuck with having to deal with the consequences. It's going to be ugly either way, the way I look at it.
Yeah, it's a pretty cynical view.
Yeah, well, I think, I agree with. Yeah, I agree with Chris. I think most people would would certainly make exceptions for, items of imminent national security. Yeah, certainly there's a role for the government to work with Twitter and Facebook or whomever that. But again, you have to be careful, because then again, everything becomes national security then if you give them that out. The Hunter Biden story, they flashed as they justified quashing it in terms of national security. Well, it turns out that it was a true story insofar as the laptop existed, and was not because of some actors from Moscow putting it there. It was actually did happen, but under the aegis of national security, if you let them apply that to everything, I mean, it could apply to a whole bunch of things that's really not national security.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think that's the tough part about it, because, the foreign adversaries, they're not just going to push only false stuff. They're going to push true stuff too. You know what I'm saying? I mean, the best false stuff is like 99% true and just has one sliver of something bad in it,
Right.
And so there's no nice little way where you can say, all right, this is cool for me to push to the side and this is not. There's always going to be, and especially when it tangles in with our politics quite a bit, because I think that with the Russian investigation and Trump and stuff, and anything that we said bad about Russia, I don't know, the Trump administration tended to want to go the opposite way with it. And so if they were to continue with anything else, it's like, it looks bad if you do anything in that direction at all. And so it's actually a good thing for Moscow, because it gives them a free out to be able to do anything and everything they want to us. And our government looks bad if they even try to stop it. So that put us at I don't know, a disadvantage, in my opinion, from that angle. But I mean, there are some, foreign threats that are going to be clearly not as closely related to our politics, and just going to be, it's going to be an easy call. But I see one day there's going to be some stuff that's going to strike right at our core and make us weaker, either, by us turning against each other or whatever, that's going to leave us susceptible one way or another. Our government's not going to be able to act just because we don't know how to act with one another.
Yeah, so the portrait you're painting of our country is that we're in an incredibly vulnerable position right now to another pandemic, to a national security emergency, just because we're so divided and we're so, in terms of the information that we take in as a country and how we interpret it, it's just so all over the place. Yeah,
you're absolutely right, Nick. And I said this a little while back, and again, doing one of these COVID postmortems, that it's a shame the government has so almost willfully fostered all of this mistrust and made it even worse. That's a shame, because the next time they might be right. They might be dead on the next time they give advice about a national emergency, say a pandemic. But a lot of people are going to look at what they say with initial suspicion. A lot of people are going to look at it with automatic rejection, simply because they've been rejected, or they've been burned too many times. I mean, how many times does Lucy get to pull back the football before Charlie Brown tells her to go fuck herself? I mean, at some point, then
it wouldn't be a kid show.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, when you just consistently mislead the public and gaslight them, the public's natural reaction is going to be, at best, suspicion, at worst, automatic rejection.
So I guess my perception of this whole thing is different than yours, in that I think that the level of cynicism is unjustified, but there is a justifiable level of cynicism, if that makes sense. It's just the population has gone way over the top. And I think one of the primary reasons for that is social media. I think social media poses a problem just in so many different facets of American society that we were not prepared for, just as evolutionary as a nation, right? That it's just kind of blown everything in different directions, and we just don't know how to get a hold of it, and we can't. And that's where we're at right now. Yeah. My personal perspective is that I'm just not as incredulous towards the government as you are, Chuck. I think that I have an expectation that they're dishonest. I think political incentives almost force people to be dishonest. And, you know, and that's shitty, right? It's shitty that it's like that, but I don't know if there's any way around it. But I don't know if there's necessarily, I just think it's too much, there's too much cynicism, and that level of cynicism has led people into believing conspiracies that are just batshit crazy on all sides of the political aisle, probably more so on the right, but I see a lot of it on the left as well.
Yeah, but again, I'll counter with, based upon the level of mendacity we've seen from the government. I mean, just from COVID, to say nothing of the myriad of other things. How many times does Lucy have to pull the football back? Again, I mean, how many times must we get burned before we are justified in having a pretty damn high level of cynicism for all things government?
Because I think I would look at it a little bit differently. I don't think, because I think that that the perspective is that it's just Lucy pulling back the football every time. But the right analogy is sometimes Lucy lets him kick it, right? And so there are plenty of times where Lucy lets him kick it. It's not like the government and all the other institutions in America coordinated in this grand conspiracy. It's more like, I think, and I think you agree with this, is that the ideologies that drive some of these institutions drove their narratives, and those narratives built the mistrust, right? So it wasn't a deliberate, misleading in a lot of instances. In addition to that, a lot of the information we were given was true, right? And a lot of the vaccines were effective, really effective on some level, but they didn't do everything. We weren't right about masks 100% of the time. The way that the political narrative kind of floated around was terrible at times, but it wasn't always wrong, right? So that's kind of why I wanted to touch on this really quick. And Sam Harris talks about this a little bit. I don't know if you guys know who Sam Harris is, but he's a guy I listen to. He's a political philosopher. He has a podcast called Making Sense. It's really good. But he touched on this Hunter Biden stuff, and I think he brings up, in my opinion, a legitimate point, because I should stipulate that with saying I also agree with you, Chuck, in that Twitter made a pretty big mistake, especially when they banned the entire New York Post. Like, it wasn't just that story; it was the entire outlet. And all the while, it comes out that the bulk of the story they had been banned for was true. Right. So that sort of undermines Twitter's credibility at the time, and justifiably so. However, and this is where there's sort of some nuance there when you talk about the cynicism and mistrust. At the beginning of this, right, when this story initially came out, what are we, 2 weeks, 3 weeks prior to the election? Right, we're in the midst of a grand pandemic where there's all kinds of misinformation floating around the internet, in addition to that, you have the Trump administration and all its affiliates, right, already talking about not agreeing to a peaceful transfer of power, right, and all of the stuff going on with that, right, and then all of a sudden you have Rudy Giuliani, right?
Not a trustworthy source.
Not a trustworthy source. And honestly, I think he might be mentally ill. Not kidding. Just if you watch him on some of these things,
I agree.
He just doesn't seem rational. Comes out with this almost unbelievable story about somebody, right? And correct me if I'm wrong, going to some sort of pawn shop or tech store of some kind and bringing this laptop with the person working there. He happened to be blind. That was also a part of this story, right? And then there was all of this insane stuff going on in this laptop, right? That almost, I mean, it was analogous to the P-tape story with Trump, right? It was just kind of like, what, right? And so all of these, including Fox News, right? It wasn't just liberal outlets denying the story. You're talking about Fox News, and I believe even some people at the New York Post. And so it was a really highly unbelievable story. Now, them choosing not to necessarily uh, uh, advertise that story at that time. Now, I think you can make a pretty persuasive argument, and I might not necessarily disagree with you that they shouldn't have done it regardless, right? But I can certainly understand the rationale behind doing it. And based on the circumstances at the time, the people who were providing the information, and the just what the story sounded like, it sounded insane, right? And so, with all of those different factors at the time, sort of burying that story, to me doesn't seem like the worst thing that Twitter has done. Now,
Let me
sure, yeah, because
just interject.
Yeah.
If that, all the elements of that story that you just mentioned, the incredulity of it, the unbelievableness of it, the timing of it, if that were about Don Jr. and not Hunter, would they have had the same reaction? I say fuck no. They would have run the hell out of that, and that's correct. The problem. That's the problem.
Right. And that
their values are not based upon journalistic or platform ethics or anything like that. It's raw fucking politics, 100%. So, you know, if they want to hide behind the shield and cudgel afforded by ethical standards, that's one thing. But you and I and everyone else both know that if this were the Don Jr. laptop, the same ethics would not have been applied.
Sure.
Case closed.
100%. The same. I don't know if that particular story would have been run. I don't know, just because some of the claims in it were pretty out there, or at least they sounded it at the time. But I think they would have been significantly more likely to run it had it been Don Jr. than had it been Hunter Biden. 100%.
And that's why I don't forgive them for for their decision here, because their decision was not based upon ethics. It was based upon politics. It was based upon the fact that this was going to hurt the candidate that they favored. That was the reason they tried to quash this, not for any ethical standards or anything. No, that had not a damn thing to do with it, because again, we know if this had been the Eric Trump laptop or the Don Jr. laptop, they would have run with it, based upon, again, with all things else being equal, I mean, equally incredulous, equally timed. So yeah, I don't give them a forgiveness for that, not a bit.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I'd say probably the quality of the story at that time was very, I kind of agree with you, Nick, that it was kind of, I don't know, tabloidish sounding at that stage in time. Nobody knew if it was true at the same time. And I think, I would say a reasonable news station might withhold from reporting on that until they, got that a little bit more solid before they just throw something out there. But again, the good job of a social media company is not the same as the job of a news company, right? Trying to see whether or not a story is good or accurate before they allow it to post on their feed, or I think the real issue there was, whether or not they kind of stifle them down so that they don't show up on people's feed as much as they probably would have otherwise, trying to make those calls. And I think that probably around late October, that October surprise is time of the year, they're probably a little bit more on edge and trying to make these decisions and calls, because I imagine there's probably a lot of wild information flying around out there, and maybe some of it was good stuff we might have got spared from, maybe not, who knows. But those are decisions that they're deciding to make. They're making calls about them and stuff like that, and of course with some hindsight, it looks like maybe they could have let that one slide through. But otherwise, I mean, at the time, it did sound kind of crazy, and they just probably like, you know what, at this point, I'm just going to throw it to the side. And I think that probably what they had in their mind was, 2016, you had, Hillary's, a lot of leaked information and stuff was going out at that period of time. How much of that do you run the story with? I think the media got, so in terms of the Comey incident and that happening, and, and it turned out to be nothing, that they, came up with, what's his name's computer to get some more emails.
Computer,
Weiner's, Anthony Weiner's computer. So but So I don't know why I had to laugh at his name, but anyways, it's just, but couldn't hold it back. I tried my best. All right. In case a lightning bolt comes down in the middle of this meeting, I wanted to know. I tried my best. I did. So, but I mean, that turned out to be nothing, but it did change the momentum. You could actually see it in the polls that after that happened, there was some momental change at a crucial time in the campaign or whatever. And a lot of people will try to say, oh, that doesn't matter, and say, oh, that, well, but then those same people will say the Hunter Biden story mattered, you know what I'm saying? And so I think a lot of people will say whatever fits their politics best on how much they hate these stories. But I think that there's a lot of criticism that these agencies get about what they allow to let through, especially during those times of the year, and what they don't. And I don't think we're ever going to fully agree with their decisions at the end of the day when they make these decisions on things, because there's going to be something that comes out that's like, why the heck did you let that parade around and you knew it was garbage? Whereas something else is going to be, more so along the lines of the Hunter Biden route, So
Right.
I don't think this is a one and done issue. We're going to be debating about this every election season here on out.
The interesting part of it is the Twitter and just generally, I mean, the story was made way worse by them trying to push it
The
down.
Streisand, they call it the Streisand effect. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. They just exacerbated it. So it didn't work. Right. But I guess the question comes down to, and you kind of touched on this before, Chuck, how we should really, I mean, how do we go about managing social media companies? And I mean, they are private entities, right? For all intents and purposes, they are owned by a private person or people, right? And so how and who they allow on, right? From a libertarian perspective, anyway, right? If we're, you know, is their own decision. Now, your argument would be, okay, fine, then the government shouldn't be suggesting things to them. And with those suggestions, there is coercion because the government has power, right? And part of that government power can be to harm social media companies, funding whatever they do, right? In some, other indirect way, right? The way that these things happen. So it sort of complicates things, right? So I was just wondering, do you guys, and this is sort of boring stuff, and we'll get to the election stuff in a minute, but do you guys have any idea how we could go about doing that? Like, what would be a reasonable way to manage a private company if you're the government and they have as much influence and power, but it's sort of like unrestrained, unlike with media outlets.
I mean,
It's hard.
the libertarian in me says, as little as possible. I mean, again, as long as it's a private entity and as long as they're not, breaking any existing laws. I mean, certainly they can't allow, libelous or slanderous information in that respect, or anything that is published is subject to, a slander suit, or in this case, a libel suit, because it would be, well, it doesn't have to be typed. I mean, you could share a video slandering someone and that would be slander. But anyway, insofar as they, work within the framework of existing business rules that govern internet-based entities, I would be very nervous about singling them out for special sanctions, simply because, again, who's supplying the sanctions? Our friendly little government. And so you have to be very careful when you single out a business for regulation just because it happens to be very, very powerful and you don't like not controlling the message. Again, I don't think they should be free from regulation insofar as, all businesses are regulated to some degree. They have to follow rules. They can't do this, that, and many other things. But in terms of above and beyond that, that would be a hard sell with me, simply because who's next on the list?
Me too. Yeah, I agree with that. Chris?
Yeah. The way I look at it is I don't think there's a perfect system that's going to be able to fix it out. I mean, I think the first question you have to kind of establish with these companies is, how are they going to be regulated? Are they going to be treated like I don't know, like a phone company where if somebody, if somebody comes up with some plot or scheme to try to, I don't know, rob our bank over the phone or whatever, do you hold the phone company liable for that just because they use that phone or whatever, or do you expect the phone company to kind of, monitor it or whatever? And I think it was an easier call to do it for a phone company than it is for the internet social media era, right? When you have these, big companies like Facebook that where people can, I don't know, plot and scheme or get together and do crimes or anything else, whatever. And and you would want to, hope that, man, there would be something that could push back or, regulate or something against this, because it's a little bit different than I don't know, with the phone company, like that data wasn't being saved anywhere. Facebook stuff, that's all being saved somewhere. They have it all in their servers and all that. So there's actually more opportunity to use algorithms and all this sort of stuff. So it makes the temptation of, okay, we can, whether it's child pornography that's flying around on there or this, that, or the other. There's a lot of ills that we realize as a society that came as a result of social media. And we're trying to rely on those companies themselves to manage those things for us. When most likely the best solution is going to have to come from the citizenry ourselves, and making these things as good as they can be, because no matter what type of pushback they give to try to say, okay, well, I mean, the way I think about it is like this. If I have say I own Facebook, right? And I'm a moral, ethical person, and I realize that, hey, there's people using my platform for, I don't know, spreading negative lies and all this other stuff, and it's messing up our politics and our elections and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, man, can I just get this a little bit more better so that I can have a wonderful influence? I don't want my legacy of this company, Facebook, that I created to be kind of tarnished because it's steering our politics down the gutter or something like that, for whatever reason. So that there, I think, is incentive enough to make some people to want to step in and do something and regulate at some point. But the second they step in and want to do something, regulate, then they become the ultimate authority on picking how it gets regulated. And all the eyes are going to look at them. And no matter how they do it, there's always going to be somebody that's going to feel like they're unfairly targeted one way or the other. Even if they did it as fair as reasonably possibly can, people are going to feel some type of way about it. There's always going to be questions at the end of the day. So I don't really think that there's a perfect way to be able to manage it all. There's always going to be somebody, that's going to be thinking one thing or another about it, and they just have to make up their mind whether they're going to do it or don't. They can try some transparency to a certain extent. Maybe they can have some site that lists out, these type of stories we've decided to, not have circulate on our site much. I mean, if you want to go to that site and, read about it there or whatever, fine, feel free, but we're just not going to have it float around our platform, and then people can make their decisions after that. But at least that gives some layer of transparency that might help out a little bit. But whether or not that's going to be enough, I don't know. If they get completely out of it, I mean, I don't think we're always going to be fully happy with the product that we're going to get on our social media either. I mean, I think that it came on us faster than we were ready for. We were all positive about, wait, yeah, wonderful connection. I live long distance from my family. Cool. I can use this internet thing to connect with them, share my pictures and all this other stuff, cute cat videos. Wow, wonderful. But we didn't realize there's a lot of side effects. It's changing up how our whole society is working up and down. Our children are growing up with these things in front of their faces, being babysat by them and stuff like that. And it's having impacts on how they relate socially and how well they develop in certain ways, or how bullying happens and all this other stuff. It just opens up whole new cans of worms that we were never ready for. We want somebody to do something about it, but anything that we do about it, we're not going to be able to satisfy us. So it's going to be like a damned if you do, damned if you don't. And I think over time, we're just going to have to learn to find some way of adapting to it. But I think the level of distrust that we have for our institutions as well as one another just lends itself to not having any type of solution. If we all had institutions that we believed in, and we all trust, and we said, hey, you guys hold it down and do this, I'll take your word for it that you can hold it down. Or maybe if we elected people to be in charge of making some decisions, who knows? I don't know. But I mean, at this stage and point in time, even if we elected people to be in charge of those decisions, I mean, we're not even trusting our elections right now too. So I don't know what to do. We just don't trust one another. I think that's the root problem. That's a root issue behind a lot of the problems that we have here. We had just a little bit more trust and good faith in one another. We might be able to work through a few things and be all right, with some imperfect solutions. Because that's really what it comes down to. Government's not going to be perfect. Everything they do is going to be imperfect, but it's whether or not those imperfections are going to blow up into something where it's a huge conflict of distrust and something way bigger than what it really is. That's the real issue.
You nailed the central point, I think, Chris. Trust.
That was good.
When you don't trust the institutions that are supposed to be guiding you, particularly those institutions that really have set a large part of our culture for generations, and when you lose that trust, boy, lost trust is almost impossible to get back. Getting that initial trust is a process, but getting lost trust is a 10 times longer process. And we're in a bad spot right now because a lot of traditional institutions, government, religion, family, we've lost a lot of trust. And social media in its own way has shown us how the sausage is made sometimes, and it's not a pretty process. And in terms of getting that trust back, that's going to be tough. And it's really doubly tough when these agencies, CDC, continue to gaslight us in the rearview mirror of COVID-19. Boy, howdy, I already don't trust you. Why are you making me trust you even less? It's very frustrating because, like I said, next time they might be right. But there's going to be a large percentage of people whose hearts will be closed.
And on that, let's talk about the upcoming election and who's going to run those agencies come 2024. Is it going to be the Republicans or the Democrats? So I just read a tweet by Nate Silver, and he was basically like, anybody who's taking anything from polling right now is stupid, essentially. I mean, he was very condescending and used those exact words, but you really can't tell anything, and you shouldn't be making any concrete statements, etc., and so on. So at the risk of sounding stupid to Nate Silver, whatever, if you do take, so if you go back to polling pre 2020, so you're talking 2019, Biden was polling significantly ahead of Trump. And I mean, in some polls it was by like 15 points, but I think on average it was like 5 to 10 points or something like that. Now we're in 2023, right? Which is, equivalent to 2019. And Biden is polling either head to head with Trump or slightly above or slightly below. And that's it. Those are all the polls you're getting. And that's before we're in, the campaign season. And so, well, I guess you're in the Republican campaign season, but Biden hasn't started campaigning yet or whatever, marketing himself. However, I really feel like these two people, right? And anybody who doesn't think Trump's going to win the Republican primary, okay, right? Obviously he's going to win. And so you have these two people. There's nobody who doesn't know who they are at this point, right? And with the exception of the economy just completely collapsing or some other event, monumentous event, it's really probably not going to change or shift anybody's mind, in my opinion, in any massive way, right? And so what I do know about general elections from just watching the past three of them closely is that the Republican Party, as a general matter, has a geographical or electoral advantage, right? And essentially what that means is that in order for a Democrat to win, they have to be polling pretty far, like 6 points or something ahead of a Republican to, is the correlating number to winning in the Rust Belt states, right? If that makes sense. You don't have anything close to that. And my whole, Biden's the problem with Biden, right, is that he looks like he's about 175 years old. And I don't give a shit what anybody says. That's what you see when that guy goes up there, right? He forgets what he says. He mumbles. He trips over his words. He has, he has to clear his throat every 15 seconds. Sometimes you wonder if he knows what direction to walk in. And it's not just because you're watching, you see these memes or you're watching half-quarter videos, right? This is what people are seeing. And the people that you have to convince aren't diehard Democrats or diehard Republicans. It's those people in those swing voters in those Rust Belt states. And I'm going to tell you right now, when he gets up on stage and he starts mumbling and bumbling his words in a debate with Trump, because he's not even who he was 4 years ago, that's going to be a problem. And I don't understand, being a predictor, an objective predictor of politics, how anybody, as much as I hate Trump and want Biden to win, not because I love Biden, but for other reasons. I think Trump is like an accelerator. I think it's inevitable that our republic's headed in a gradual, apocalyptic direction. But I think Trump's an accelerator of that, and more so than Biden, much more so. And so I want him to win. I don't think he can, and I have not heard a good argument that he can, right? Or not one that was persuasive to me. So, yeah.
First off, Nate Silver's right. It's way early.
He is right.
Yeah, we're over a year from election day.
He's just a dick. He's just a dick.
Yeah, well, primary season is in full swing, and in just a matter of a few months, the first primary votes are going to be taken. So in that respect, it's not that far off. And so again, you got two entities to consider: the primaries and the general election. First off, just again, and I've said this before, if it comes down to Trump and Biden again, there's no way I will vote for either one of them. Both of them suck mightily. And it is a sad, sad commentary that for the second quadrennium, these are the two best we can come up with. Good God Almighty, we are fucked if this is what it comes down to. I mean, you want to talk about the lowest common denominator. It is sickening that it looks like, all things being equal. Now, that having been said, I think we're starting to see the preliminary rumblings of a Democratic Party that does not want Joe Biden to be their nominee. Problem is, time is working against them because, again, primary season, there is no primary season right now for the Democrats per se. I mean, you got Robert Kennedy running, but right now, he's not a serious challenger yet to Biden. That could change. But I really do honestly believe that the Democratic powers that be would far prefer Gavin Newsom to be their nominee next year. They're starting to, again, we're starting to see the inklings. We're starting to see a few of these op-ed pieces that all of a sudden realize just how old Biden is and how feeble he has looked in the past couple of years. Yeah, I mean, he's lost a lot off his fastball. There's no doubt about that. He's not, full-blown dementia by any stretch, but, he's not 100% guy, and he certainly doesn't radiate the type of image that I would like to see in a U.S. president. He looks feeble. He looks confused. To say nothing about him being absolutely hostile to the Constitution, which is repugnant.
Nobody cares about that, Chuck.
Yeah, nobody gives a shit about that anymore. But yeah, I mean,
just looks old. That's it.
Yeah. I really do believe that there are some higher ups in the DNC that are trying to see if they can make that happen. Kamala is not a possibility because she just is so unpopular with the electorate.
But what are you going to do?
I know, that's the thing. What are you going to do? I mean, you've got
even if they could do it, right? Even if that was a plausible scenario and they could kind of like do the old switcheroo, just by replacing Kamala Harris, you're replacing the first female African-American vice president in history with a white man.
They got a lot of splaining to do to the base.
You're talking to a base of supporters who, like it would create like a huge
I know. That's why this trial balloon is not even on the horizon. It's just they're like, oh, let's get it 2 feet off the ground, see what happens. But yeah, I mean, I really do think there's a lot of people high up in the DNC that do not want Joe Biden as their nominee next year. But like you said, Nick, because I mean, it's usually you default to the vice president, and if you don't do that, you got some splaining to do
Well,
because
she's I think the most unpopular vice president, more so than like Dick Cheney
yeah.
after he shot someone in the face. Like that was the polling that I heard, that her polling is worse than that.
Maybe if we send her hunting, her numbers go up. I don't know. I mean, it's weird. I mean, she is what she is. She's a reliable left politician, but I mean, evidently she rubs people the wrong way. I mean, I don't know, but I do know that there's
I don't know what it is either. I mean, I don't like her, but I don't like a lot of people.
I mean, a lot of people make fun of her for some of the just banal things she says. Like it sounds like a something you'd read on a greeting card or something. I mean, she's very shallow. I mean, there's no depth to her. I mean, she's a politician. I mean, she is what she is.
She has
But,
a prosecutorial background too. That I think.
oh yeah, she's got that, and quite frankly, that should make her very unpopular on the left because she was a very, very aggressive prosecutor for for drug and alcohol type crimes, with a very strong record, let's say, of putting people behind bars. So, but no, I mean, again, just political reality being what it is, I feel sure a lot of the people in the DNC would like to have Gavin Newsom and not Joe Biden on the ballot next year. But you're right, Nick. How do you delicately do that without really pissing off the base? I don't know. Biden may once again be the least offensive option for the Democrats, much like he was in 2020. On the Republican side, I mean, shit. I don't wish
Trump is just dominating. He's ahead by 50 points in some polls.
I don't wish anybody to, I don't wish anybody to die, Nick, but there are some people whose death I would mind less than others.
Listen, I'll look the other way.
Just saying. But again, it just absolutely amazes me. Trump is poison. That is the nicest thing I could think to say about him.
You know who I'd like to see run for president? The governor of Georgia. Was it Kemp?
Yeah. Again, out. He seems to be a very centrist Republican. Could certainly sew up some votes in the South, but I mean,
integrity though. He has integrity. I just like integrity.
That's the thing, though. I mean, as a libertarian, I don't like any politician. I mean, I don't like any of them. There's just some that are less repulsive than others. DeSantis.
Tough being a libertarian. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I try to find my heroes in areas other than politics.
That's true.
But yeah, I just again, there's just degrees of repugnancy, and to me, some of the least repugnant of the GOP candidates. I mean, I guess DeSantis, but then again, I have major issues with the way he uses government as a cudgel, which is a very non-conservative thing to do. But yeah, right now, all things being equal, unless Trump kicks the bucket, he's the nominee. I mean, I don't see the other candidates overcoming those numbers. I mean, 40, 50 point lead. Yeah, and the stupider he gets, the more support he gets. The wilder things he says, the more fucking indictments he gets, it goes up 3 or 4 points. Jeez, you want to talk about bulletproof? Jeez.
David Brooks made the point that the indictments are what's making him more popular. At the beginning of this, DeSantis was almost like edging him a little bit, and then all of a sudden that indictment in Florida came up, and he just took it and run.
Yeah, because the faithful see him as a martyr now. I mean, it's and martyrs are very powerful things. That's the wild thing. If Trump did not say much of anything while all this is going on, he would be insanely popular. But he has to run his mouth about things and show how idiotic and toxic he is. And people like me say, okay, certainly not going to vote for you now. But again, Nick, unless something weird happens, it's going to be Trump, Biden, 2 electric boogaloo next year, and I'm going to drink heavily.
I heard Chris is going to be voting for Donald Trump in this election, just because.
I thought about voting for Trump, but I'll pass on it.
He's got the red shirt on. I'm just saying.
Does that say MAGA
Uh,
on it? If you lift it
say
up,
what?
MAGA.
Say
My
MAGA.
MAGA shirt. MAGA shirt. Yeah, of course. Where'd the logo? It fell off. But of course I can't vote for Trump. There's no way I can do it for him. So and Biden's the lesser evil that I'm willing to go with for that. And it's gonna be, I agree that it's gonna be them two at the end of the day. Because you can't. It's hard to get rid of an incumbent president. So if Biden wants to run, I'm sure there are some people probably talking to him like, "Don't run, Biden." Try to switch it up a little bit. But if he wants to run and he made up his mind, he wants to run a second time. The only thing you can do is challenge him, but then that starts looking bad. Makes your own side look bad when you're fighting amongst each other, and you're tearing down the last 4 years basically, that whatever you come out with, you've basically given so much ammunition to the other side. It's gonna probably make that next election look terrible, and that's why they're just gonna let Biden walk straight through it. Nobody's gonna challenge him. Gavin Newsom's not. Maybe in 2028 he might come along, but he's definitely. I don't think he's coming in at this point. People would have put their name in a hat, I think, if they're planning on doing something. If anybody's serious on the Democrat side is planning on doing something, but I don't think that's going to happen. So, Republican thought side, I mean, man, it's hard to really, I mean, of course,
Well,
Chris
Chris
Christie looks
Christie.
good just because he's willing to criticize Trump. And I mean, I feel like that's a freaking low bar, in order to make someone palatable, that you're willing to do that, because a lot of them are just, yeah, I think the whole GOP, they want to stay quiet about him. It's like, man, I know that stuff he did was crazy. I'm just gonna stay quiet and say nothing so that the supporters, at least the base, think that I probably support him since I'm not criticizing him. And then if I ever get stuck into a situation where I actually do have to give my appointment, I can always kind of figure out how I'm gonna wiggle it later on in the future. But
I think the governor here in Virginia did the great. Just a real quick interjection, Chris.
yeah.
Governor here in Virginia, Glenn Youngkin, when he scored his upset in 2021, I thought he handled the Trump elephant as well as anyone else. He basically kept him at arm's length. He never pushed him away, but he never pulled him in. He whatever, somehow found that happy medium where he did not overtly court Trump supporters, but he ended up getting their vote anyway. So yeah, you make a great point. How much do you embrace the madness?
Yeah. And that's been the struggle that the GLP's had all this whole time, is because Trump has such a big control over the party, even though he's out of office now. I don't think it's as strong as it was maybe back in 2020, but I think it's still pretty strong. And that a lot of people just simply don't want to piss him off. And I think there's a lot of the contenders on the primary and the GOP side are just hoping that maybe Trump falls to the wayside through this legal situation or something, and then maybe one of them might show up on top as the person who ends up benefiting. So I feel like they probably feel like they're all just competing with each other, as who's going to be the number two, so that if something happened to Trump, then they can get upgraded up to number one, basically. But I think, yeah, based on what you were saying, the base, every indictment that comes up, they're going to support him even stronger. And I feel like that same type of, I mean, it's very clear it's happening now, but I feel like that same wind was behind Trump's back in 2016. That as the media kept on criticizing him and calling him a joke and all this other stuff, that just gave him more, support. People just want to, like, I'm going to prove you wrong. I want to stick it to the media type of thing. And so, voila, we get Donald Trump because they wanted to stick it to the media. Not a good deal for me, but I mean, it's just, it is what it is. But I try not to guide my life based on, being the opposite of what, the people I hate do, so if they indict somebody, then I'm gonna vote for them type of thing. That's just not how I'm going to operate ever. Even if I like the person a lot, or, well, if I like them a lot already, I might vote for them anyways. But you can't make somebody that I hate suddenly look good and make me support them, through that type of tactic. So, but yeah, it's early. Nate Silver's, I think is right that it is too early. I think the only part that I do give you a little bit of deference in that is because I think traditionally, before you give Biden a chance to actually give his counter argument, basically try to make his case for why he should be voted, you only really hear one voice pushing back against Biden by the GOP primary folks, because they're not even fighting each other as strongly as they are fighting against Biden. So you got kind of a one narrative that's kind of pushing the main agenda, but as soon as Biden really kicks his campaign into gear, he's actually spending good money, putting his narrative out there in swing states and all that stuff, and you get a poll start coming out when that's good and going. I think that's a better barometer. I think generally that's my general statement for any election. The one special thing about this election is that we have Donald Trump on the ballot. And one thing that happens when Trump is on the ballot is that people tend to be pretty clear about where they stand. It's not so much that I need a good argument to convince me about how I feel about Trump or not, or whether I plan on voting him. Most people kind of know where they stand on this guy and stuff like that. So I do understand where you're coming from, and I do look at those things and should, there should be a little bit of troubling wonder, just like, wow, how is he getting this much support when people know who he is and all that other stuff. But I think part of that is the absence makes the heart grow fonder to a certain extent. When Trump gets out of office, and then you start complaining about the new guy, and then Trump said every time something happens with Biden, whether it's inflation goes up or anything else that you have issue with, it's like, see, that would have never happened under me. That's kind of the, everything was peaches and roses, and our economy, everybody was doing cartwheels and all this stuff. I can bring back the good old days, whatever. And so you can kind of do like your ex-boyfriend might have did and convince you that everything was great when our relationship was together. Forget the reason why you broke up with me in the first place. It was all wonderful. So I think there's a little bit of that going on. And if Biden's a good campaigner and he has good messages, he can remind people of the reason why they didn't vote for him in 2020. But how effective he'll be at that is the good question. So yeah, I am troubled by the fact that he's doing so with this early on, but at the same time, it really depends on how well Biden's able to make a counter message. Another thing I will say is that as far as the debates, didn't the GOP say they didn't want to do the debates no more? They're pulling out of those, is what I understood. So I don't think there even is going to be a debate.
You're talking about the general election debates?
That's what I thought that they pulled out of. Maybe I was wrong.
They pulled out of one in particular because of who was going to moderate it. I don't think they just said, no, we're not going to do any of them. I think there was one.
That would be a terrible decision for Trump.
Oh, yeah, that would be. But, Trump is not participating in the GOP, the primary debates.
Because he doesn't need to.
Yeah, I understand that. I mean, there's only one place for him to go, and that's down. But,
right.
Yeah, I get that.
So, I'm looking at the article. It's a Reuters article. It says Republican Party withdraws from the U.S. Commission on Presidential Debates. That was in April of 2022. That's a Reuters article.
Okay.
That might have to do with the way they're conducting themselves or something they did.
I knew there was one debate that they were planning, and it was like, again, one of the CNN talking heads was going to moderate that the Republicans didn't like. So, but okay. Yeah, I mean. I hadn't heard
so that's not a permanent thing or anything.
Yeah, pulling out of the commission doesn't mean you automatically eschew the debates, but I don't know.
What? All right. So no wiggling out of this question. You have to answer it. You can't say no one. So if we're all going to agree, Trump's a nominee, Biden's a nominee. Who wins, Trump or Biden? Chuck?
Right now, based on the demographics, I would have to say Biden, simply because Trump won in 2016 because he was able to take a chink out of that blue wall. Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, he won them. In 2020, he lost them. And I don't see anything right now that would make me think he is more popular in any of those 4 states than he was in 2020. Now, is Biden less popular in those 4 states? Possibly. But I don't think it's to the point where it would be enough to flip over the difference between those two. Again, we got a year plus to go, so a lot of things can happen. But as we're speaking now, September 2023, if those are the 2 nominees, I give Biden a very narrow edge in the Electoral College.
Chris?
I'm gonna agree with him and say that Biden wins it all. Even though I see some troubling wins, like I just said about people at that absence making the heart grow fonder. There are also demographics winds of change that that our voting patterns have pretty strictly followed for quite some time in this country. So,
Yeah.
and I think because of that, changes in places like Georgia suddenly now is a purple state, and they been leaning more blue and blue um, over time. So, and different things like that. Those wins, I think, push in the Democrats' favor, and where I think after Romney lost in 2012 and they did that autopsy, so to speak, where they said that hey, they need to become a more diverse party, maybe reach out to the Hispanic population and do the immigration reform, blah blah blah, yakety smackety. I feel like Trump was the rebellion of the Republican Party to rebel against that. And what they did is they kind of doubled down on their base instead of expanding it out, just focus on the majority white base that they had and excite them up enough to pull them up. And I think Trump was able to do that. But he barely was able to do it. I think he was kind of like the last hurrah of going that strategy that if they wanted to, I think they really do truly need to go that more of a diverse party and widen up their tent quite a bit in order to be able to have a chance in elections. But I think that with Trump being around, it's impossible for them to do that. So they're going to take a loss on this one, and I think they'll probably have to reconsider it maybe for 2028 to doing a different strategy that's closer to what they thought about in 2012.
You mentioned Pennsylvania and Georgia, Georgia in particular, getting bluer and bluer by the year, it seems. Those are also two states where Trump pushed very bad Senate candidates last year and was soundly repudiated. Oz in Pennsylvania and Herschel Walker in Georgia. And the voters in those two respective states really by proxy rejected Trump, I think, in voting in Warnock and Fetterman. Respectively. So yeah, I think those two states, those are two states he absolutely has to have, and I don't think he can get them.
All right, so let me just push back on what you guys are saying. So first of all, yeah, I mean, the demographics are always changing, right, throughout the country. In terms of Hispanics who support the Republican Party, it's higher than ever, right? And the number of or percentage of Hispanics who supported Trump in 2020, even though he lost, was still higher than ever. I believe that's just all minority populations, just generally.
Yeah.
The other part of this is too, in 2020, Trump got 10 million more votes than he got in 2016. So it's not like he did poorly, right? It's just Biden did exceptionally well. And I think there were two primary reasons for that. The first reason is he was Obama's vice president, and people loved Obama, including this guy, right? I really liked Obama. I didn't agree with everything he did, but I really liked him. And I also liked Joe Biden then, right, too. So there was that, and there was also Trump in your face every friggin' day for 4 years on Twitter, scaring the shit out of you and everybody in your family, right? That drove people. If you wanna get people to vote, piss them off or scare the shit out of them. And Trump did a good on both those counts, right? Him being in the background all this time, I think has and him not being on Twitter has probably served him well, right? Because now he's not in the forefront of everybody's mind all the time. He's not scaring people. He's not constantly pissing them off. Now, I think Trump's his own worst enemy, right? And the only way I see Biden winning is by Trump losing. So that means Trump just goes out and just does Trump stuff for the next year, but really goes Trump on himself. So but as far as Biden goes, he's lost that drive that people have because Trump isn't there all the time and Americans have bad memories, right? Trump still had a lot of enthusiasm despite all of that stuff. I mean, the fact that he still got 74 million votes, which, by the way, is the second most in history besides Biden, right, is pretty incredible considering his behavior and all of that, right? And then I think the biggest, probably in my opinion, the thing that pushes Trump over the line is Biden, his presentation. And it's not that he's old in just his years, right? Because Trump is old in his years. Bernie Sanders is old in his years, right? Biden is old in his behavior. He looks old, right? And, I was talking to my supervisor at work about this the other day, and I'm a child investigator. I work for Child and Family Services. And we were talking about, so we do safety plans with like parents and grandparents and stuff. And, my supervisor said, I wouldn't have, if I knew Biden, I wouldn't have him, based on what I'm seeing, I wouldn't have him be a caretaker to a child. And I'm thinking that too. If I knew Biden, I'm not sure I'm leaving my 2-year-old with it, right? But we're going to trust him to run an entire country. And that's what people are going to think, because ordinary people who aren't hyper political and have whatever mental illness we have, right, that drives us in this direction, it really does, he's just average, everyday, unaffiliated, politically unaffiliated people are going to see his behavior and just be like, this dude is not up for the job, And so take it or leave it. I adamantly disagree with you. Maybe I'm wrong. I sincerely hope I'm wrong, but it is what it is. So,
like I said, 2024 will be the year of drinking heavily.
not for this
Either
guy.
way, right?
Yeah, really.
But
Yeah.
I take what Chris said though. I'm done caring. When Trump won in 2016, my whole life was over, right? Like I was so upset about it, and I just remember. I mean, I was like legitimately depressed that he won. I'm done with that. Like, if he wins, he wins. It is what it is. I'm just gonna kind of turn my head and just get on with my life because there's nothing I can do about it. And following him every step of the way just drives me nuts. So,
Sure.
Yeah. All right. Anything else? Thanks for coming, guys. Appreciate it.
You bet. Thanks for having me. This is fun.
Yeah. Yeah, it was good being here. Appreciate having the discussion and everything. We'll look forward to seeing how the race evolves over time and everything. And I do agree with you that, Trump is, not Trump, but Biden, he's not as sharp as he was in the 2008 primary. If you look at some of that footage from back there,
Look at his YouTube videos. I mean, it's really crazy how different.
He's definitely not as sharp and everything. I mean, I would say, me personally, I'm not looking for my president to necessarily be that sexy, sharp person who's witty after spit and everything. Can you be able to function and sign, whatever, do the regular roles of the duties, or whatever, sitting at a desk, and even if you're not that beautiful in front of a TV, right? I was willing to stick with that, and take the status quo of a older man who's not quite as sharp, just to get Trump out of office, because I felt like he was, crazy and out on a limb. And I think that whatever good that happened in his administration was mostly in spite of him, as opposed to because of him. However, with so many people who left out of the office claiming that, man, it's a circus show in there. I mean, I don't think most people wanted to believe him, because most of the supporters just wrote them all off as, never Trumpers or all these other names, just gave excuses to not believe what was going on in there, but it was coming from their own people. So at some point you got to say, hey, there's a little something to that. And he was kind of purging out the people who were trying to keep a little bit of the sanity in the White House. And so I feel like round 2 is going to be where he picks better, or for his for his sake better, not for my sake or America's sake necessarily, but the people who are going to be like, yes, sir, and then rubber stamp everything that he wants to do. And I think that second administration is going to be just horrible. But so that's why I wouldn't want it to go through. I mean, I can vote for, I don't know, a rubber stamp probably before I vote for Trump. But I don't know. It's just the times that we have. It's sad that these are the only choices that we have. But you know, I think it's all a reflection of us. I think our politicians are as, you know, as poor as we are as people, I would say at the end of the day, because we're so divided. We hate each other. Even if we say, hey, you know, I'm a proud America, a lot of American, and I, you know, I love our Americans and stuff. A lot of times, even when we talk about Americans, we're only talking about our subgroup of Americans that we agree with. We're not, we don't, we call the other people, they're not the real Americans and stuff like that. And so I feel like we're so divided. We need to really come to a point where we can actually trust in each other to be able to work together and make something happen. Because I think the foundational pieces of our government really aren't able to happen because we don't want it to happen, and then we're confused about why we get incompetent people up here that are breaking it apart because we sent them there to do that half the time. So I'm hopeful that, you know, things will turn brighter in the future. Some people might say I'm a pessimist, but I try to be a realist more so, and just call it as I see it. But we'll see how things go in the future.
Drink
Yeah.
heavily. Drink heavily.
Our
Everyone.
leaders, our leaders are a reflection of us. I think that's
Yeah.
true. Yeah.
Unfortunately.
All right, guys. On that note, thank you for coming, and I'm going to end the podcast.
Take care, bud.
All right.
All right,
Later.
see you.